They have we celebrate it every year. And Elohim, God says to them, he says, this will be the first day of the month for you. Now, we find it in Exodus. It's also Leviticus 23. I think I'll go there, read it that one. Okay, starting in verse 5. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. So why all of a sudden do we see here, and God's specific about it? He doesn't kind of leave it open, like if you want. He's specific. Why all of a sudden would he have said, okay, this is to be the first day for you? Because clearly it wasn't. So he was now saying to them, this will be the first day of the month for you. Now, if we look at what the story, as many of you know what the story of Pesach is about, it's about redemption. So now, because God had decided that the yearly festivals were going to be around his son. Now, we already know that even if you look in Adam and Hava, right, clearly they were talking with God, and more than likely the one they saw was a pre-incarnate Yeshua. So it wasn't as if they hadn't seen, it wasn't as if they hadn't known about Yeshua before. But this was now to be a bit different, because we know that Shabbat does have to do with rest. So now we who, because of the fall, because you remember in Genesis 3:15, he says to them, he says that I will send enmity between you and your son, and you shall bruise his heel. Let me just read it here. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. So because of their fall, things were no longer the way God intended. Now, because if you look, really, even before Adam and Hava fell, they were fully human as we are. So sin isn't necessarily integral to humanity. So then, because we know that in that verse, so eventually something was going to change. Now, of course, many years would pass before Abraham, and then Abraham, eventually Isaac, Jacob. Then Jacob, we have the 12 tribes who, I'm doing a brief history here, a quick one, go into Egypt. They're there for 430 years, approximately. And we even know that Joseph actually sells his brethren, his brothers, when Elohim visits you, take my bones out of here to the promised land. So he already believed that one day they would be set free and taken out of Egypt, even though at that time Egypt was Joseph, of course, being one of the brothers, and others after Joseph, they treated Israel very well. It was only many years later that this Pharaoh rose, who mistreated them, and then Elohim, God, brings them out. So now, for that, it's the time to make the change, to show that it was always about his son. Now we know there was already Shabbat, which is Shabbat, shows us is the mark for the other feasts. It starts with Shabbat, which is the seventh day of the week, and because of that, he makes this change. So, and if we see here, so because of that, and if you look at, as we go on, we eventually, of course, we come to Shavuot. Eventually from Shavuot, there's this time of betrothal. And unfortunately, during that betrothal, we know that Israel was unfaithful. And so eventually God would disperse them out of their land after he had brought them in. So there's now that they had to, God's going to call them back. And many of our songs that we sung today had to do with that very thing, teshuvah, returning to Yeshua, returning to the Lord of all the earth, the God of Israel. And so if we look at Micah 6, verse 8, I'll go there. It's interesting, we'll look at that too. One of the verses that was read, talks about what they were supposed to bring, a goat, and the other animals that were part of what they were to do at that time. Now, the goat represented sin. Just a quick, while I'm on that, I'll mention, if we notice too, many of the sacrifices were not for sin. They were for thanking God for peace. They weren't, so just because you brought a sacrifice didn't necessarily mean that that you were bringing it for a sin that you had committed. And if we go to Micah 6, verse 8, he talks about there, here we go. And I'll go back a little bit so we can get a little bit better of a context. Because it's interesting what we'll hear here versus what we heard earlier in Numbers 29, which Andrew read for us. Hear ye now what the Lord saith, arise, contend thou before the mountains, let the hills hear thy voice. Hear ye, O mountains, the Lord's controversy, and ye strong foundations of the earth. For the Lord hath a controversy with his people, and he will plead with Israel. O my people, what have I done unto thee, and wherein have I wearied thee? Testify against me. For I brought thee up out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed thee out of the house of servants. And I sent before thee Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what Balak king of Moab consulted, what Balaam the son of Beor answered him from Shittim unto Gilgal, that ye may know the righteousness of the Lord. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before the Lord? Bow myself before the high God. Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what did the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. So here we see in verse 6 here, and verse 5, and we just read in Numbers 29 that God considered them a pleasing aroma. But now, all of a sudden, he says, why are you still bringing them? Any ideas on why he said that? Anybody? No? Okay. He said that to show that they had lost their faith. Their heart had turned away. So that is why eventually they would be kicked out of their land. Outwardly, if you saw what they were doing, most of them were still keeping the feasts. They were still keeping Shabbat. So it wasn't that they didn't know what to do. It wasn't that they weren't necessarily doing it wrong, but something had been mixed in to what they were doing. And unfortunately, we know, if you look at the history on Israel, and this is our history too, it's not just theirs, because we are grafted in. But if you saw what happened to Israel, they turned away because for many reasons, but mainly because their heart was turned. And they had forgotten to obey God according to his word. And we know Deuteronomy, Moses talks about that. So here we have, as you can see, they lost, in a sense, they lost their sight. They lost their reason because of what was happening to them. But God doesn't say that's it. We know things got tougher on them after this, and we know, he's bringing them back, and things are going to get tougher a little bit before he does bring them back completely, like Paul says. But here we see that, and if we also look at 7:18 to verse 20, who is a God like unto thee, that pardoneth iniquity, and passeth by the transgression of the remnant of his heritage? He retaineth not his anger forever, because he delighteth in mercy. He will turn again, he will have compassion upon us. He will subdue our iniquities, and that will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. That will perform the truth to Jacob, and the mercy to Abraham, which thou hast sworn unto our fathers from the days of old. So we see here, go ahead to the next slide there, Lois. Oh, sorry. Okay. So Genesis, if we go to Genesis, which was read today, 21, verses 1 to 34. Thank you. So the first thing we notice there is that Adonai says, and he does. Because we know that a year before that, Adonai showed up and told Sarah that she would have a son. Now, of course, who was born before Isaac is born? Ishmael. Okay, that's right. So Ishmael's born first. So that showed why was Ishmael born? He was born because both, we are all guilty of this, but in this case, Abraham and Sarah had lost their faith. They thought, God's not doing it, because I'm too old or whatever, which was going on. Obviously, they were very old. God's not doing it yet. When's he going to do it? Why don't you go, Abraham, I have a good idea. Go sleep with my slave. So Abraham does what he's told. He goes out, he sleeps with Hagar. Hagar gets pregnant. Because of that, she has some pride a little bit against Sarah, and now Isaac is born, and Isaac is circumcised on the 8th day, just the way that Abraham was already commanded. And so then in the verse there, we notice that Sarah laughs, and the others. Why is Sarah and the others laughing? Why are they laughing with her? Why are they laughing with her? Yeah, because she actually had a son. So it was tears of joy, right? And it's interesting, Lual and others here who are able to read the Hebrew will see a bit of a play on words. Because in the very next verse, Ishmael, in a sense, is mocking. And in a little bit of what I studied, some of them believe it was a sin of sexual deviancy. That's that way. It wasn't just like, it was like he was really kind of having sport with Isaac. So, of course, Sarah being a good mother, what is the next thing she's going to do? She's going to say, cast out the slave woman and her son. So, and just a quick little bit here, Galatians 4, 1-31, right? What's Paul talking about there? What's his midrash? Who does he use in his midrash? Hagar and Sarah. And he's doing a midrash because who does Hagar represent? Hagar represents sin. Sarah represents the free woman. Ishmael represents the son of sin. Isaac, the son of freedom. So, I won't go much into that, but that's basically what that midrash is on. The analogy he's using there is this idea of what we read today, and how therefore Sarah, as if she had some understanding into what God was going to do and what God had to do, because Sarah now tells Abraham, the son of the slave woman will have nothing to do, and the mother will have nothing to do with me and my son. Because through my son, eventually would come redemption. And so, but Abraham's response, if we look at his response, Abraham's response is what? It's his son. He loves his son. He doesn't want his son to leave, of course, even though, but God says to him, no, you listen. And we'll get to why I kind of mentioned that in a few verses here. You listen to Sarah. Interesting. He waited for God to, this time he waits for God to confirm the fact that he should kick them out. But in the case with Sarah's like, go sleep with Hagar, it's like, obviously he just goes and does it. He doesn't wait for okay, God, what should I do? Right? But so we go on here, and so he gives them some water, and he gives them some food. Obviously, we knew water and food wouldn't last too long there. So we see all of a sudden Hagar brings Ishmael, and then she leaves because they ran out of water. Now, what does Hagar? So Hagar left. What does that say about Hagar versus Abraham? Seems Hagar didn't care as much as Abraham, because she was afraid to see her son die. She didn't want to be there. If you care about somebody, you really care about them, and they're going to die. Not usually, you want to be there. You want to be there. You want to help comfort them when you know they're going to die. Hagar, she's a bit selfish. She knows he's going to die, but she doesn't want him to, so she backs off about a bow shot away. Because if we see it in the verse in that same chapter, it also talks about. So we know of, obviously Hagar was weeping, but she was in a sense weeping more for her own self. She knew too she would probably die if she didn't get water or food either. But who does God hear? The voice of the lad. It's not that Hagar is not crying out. He hears Ishmael. Why? Because Ishmael was truly, there's nothing he could do about it. Right? So he says that his crying out was genuine. God hears him. God says to Hagar, why are you crying? Grab the lad, go, there's a well of water, get some water, and right then we know. And Ishmael survives. It's also interesting, we should note here too, that even though Ishmael was not the seed of freedom, God still keeps his blessing towards Ishmael. Because God had already promised Abraham that all of his descendants would be blessed by him. Now we know the blessing for Isaac is greater because of eventually Yeshua would come. But my point here is to show that God always keeps his word, even for those who do not believe in him. That's why he says in other places, I send the rain on the good and the right and the good and the good and the bad. He sends rain on both of them because it's who he is. In the end, he still has the final decision with what's going to happen to them. But in the meantime, because of who he is, and specifically here, because Ishmael is still Abraham's son, he says to Abraham, because of you, I will bless your son. So he does. He blesses Ishmael. Ishmael becomes an archer. God is with him while he's out hunting. God blesses him. Interesting, where do we see Hagar goes? Where does Hagar go to get the wife for Ishmael? Yes, Egypt. So interesting, right? This whole idea of, even though she doesn't know it, she's going back to the idea of like slavery, which is, slavery, that's where eventually Isaac would come out of. But because his name is changed to Israel. So, eventually becomes, he's one of the followers of Israel. It's Jacob that has his name changed. So, that idea again of Egypt. And that's the other thing that Galatians talks about. Egypt represents sin because they were in bondage. So God has to take them out. He takes them out. They're unfaithful. Here we see the same thing happening through Isaac. He calls Abraham. He's saying, Abraham, I made you a promise. He's calling them back. So now that they will have faith, they will have faith that God does what he says. And if we see here, it's a bit of we see a bit of a turning here. We can kind of see how all these work out. But if you look at the story, the last few verses there, where Abraham and Abimelech, this is the second time that they meet. So they had previously met before. Now they're meeting a second time. Now, interesting, why does Abimelech go to Abraham? Because if you see if you look at what does Abimelech see that Abraham has that he doesn't? God is with him, and he sees that God's blessing him. So his reason for going is a bit selfish as well, because he's afraid that one day. That one day Abraham might go out and take him out and take his land from him. So because he sees how God is blessing him. Now we know eventually that would happen, but it wasn't going to happen for many years after Abimelech's time. So, but Abimelech goes, he sees Abraham being blessed. He says, let's make a covenant. It's more for Abimelech than it is for Abraham. Because he knows, he sees, oh, look at Abraham being blessed in my land. I better keep my eye on you. Because I don't want to be caught if you try to take my land. All right? So, of course, Abraham had no intention at this point of doing that. So they make a covenant. It's also interesting that the 7 ewe lambs that Abraham brought is the same to the 7 ewe lambs that are expected to be brought in Numbers 29 that was read. So to me, Abraham had some idea already of what was going to happen eventually in the tabernacle and then the temples. Because God was showing him a little bit beforehand, even the idea of the whole Pesach thing. It seems that Abraham may have had a bit of an idea of that as well. So we see here Abimelech goes and Abraham, they meet, they make a covenant. And it's interesting, I'll just put that out there. Those of you who know a little bit of Hebrew, Abi could, in this case, mean father or owner of, and Melech usually means servant. So, anyway, so I put that out there. Okay, before we go on here, any other questions or comments? I don't think we have a lot of time, though, do we? Okay, I'll just keep going. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. We'll actually, the next one, we'll just jump to, go right down to 1 Samuel, because the Leviticus and Numbers, there's not much to say. I said a little bit with what happened with Abraham and the 7 ewe lambs being brought, but we don't really have not much to spend on there, except that we're also told, as we're doing today, blowing the shofar. So 1 Samuel 1, verses 1 to 17. Also, I should mention that they believe, so I was trying to figure out why did they choose 1 Samuel 1, 1 to 17, and before this, Genesis 24, 1 to 34. Because if you do a little bit of study, they believe that both of them were born during Yom Teruah, Rosh Hashanah. That's the only explanation I could find. If some of you have a better one or one that makes more sense, you can share that later. Let's keep going. So we see here Elkanah. It talks about Elkanah the Ephraimite. He has 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Hannah has children already. Peninnah doesn't. They're going up to Shiloh to worship, and her Peninnah is again, we kind of the idea of mocking her, not in the same way, but still kind of this idea of laughing at her, like, oh, I'm better than you because I have children, you don't. Some of you have read if you have some of the other research would say that she was trying to laugh in an encouraging way. I mean, it doesn't seem too encouraging to me when poor Hannah is crying tears because of what's happening to her because she doesn't have children. So anyhow, let's keep going. And it says in verse 10, and she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Now, I actually, in my notes, I went to verse 17 because I think, again, this will show us a little bit more of who God is. And that her crying out her tears were sincere. And she was really crying out to God because she didn't have a child. So it wasn't because she, in this case specifically, it doesn't say that we just see she's crying out because she's not pregnant. It wasn't because she had, we don't see anything about her committing a sin here, but that she wanted a child. So God hears, God answers. And it's interesting, for whatever reason, Eli does not see what's really going on. So at first he's like, why are you drunk? Because he can see her lips moving. Oh, sorry. Wow, sorry. Turn this off. There we go. Sorry about that. Next time I'll remember to turn it off. So he sees her lips moving, but he hears no words. And so then she goes to him. She's like, I'm not drunk. I'm not a person of Baal, which has to do with, these different sins. And I have a legitimate reason here. And verse 16, I'll read. Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. In verse 17, then Eli answered and said, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. And we know that shortly after this, Hannah became pregnant, and then she had other sons after that as well. So again, we see this idea of coming back. We see the idea of, because Samuel was clearly used. In fact, he is considered probably the last judge, because after this, of course, we would have the kings, Saul and then David, and then the other kings after. So, and he answers the prayer. And so I think that also just to show that a little more of this reality that he was probably born during this time of the year. Same with when Isaac was born. So let's go to 1 Thessalonians here, 4:1-18. And of course we know what was one here clearly says the trump shall sound, or the shofar shall sound, and the dead in Messiah shall rise. And of course, it also talks about, in the beginning, it talks about how we are to live towards each other, towards our brothers and our sisters, and that we are not to live as those who are outside of God. So let's go here to it was very, very similar to how Abraham was treating Hagar and Ishmael, right? He still cared about them very much, and we are supposed to care for each other that same way. And if we look at verse 13 here, but I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others which have not slept. And I should mention again, this is also why many of us here who are choosing to facilitate the teaching is because we are volunteer, because it says there in that verse 12, it says there that they all might be, that we are to work with our hands. So, that ye may walk honestly toward them that are without, and that ye may have lack of nothing. So I think it's another verse. Although we know that Yeshua, I believe it's in Matthew, he does actually, and Paul does quote this, he does actually say that one who's laboring, who's spending their time teaching, is deserving of what they get, that that they have the right. But I should give a little bit of some history on that. One of the reasons why Paul chose not to and chose to continue to do his own work, because he was a craftsman with leather, was because if in the one of the books of, if you go back and way back, and it talks about how if a prophet stays one day, fine. If he stays two, kick him out. Because, and even today, we see that often, these big kind of, we've heard these big pastors that are like, oh, if you send me this, you'll get all these blessings. So people send all this stuff, but they don't get anything out of it. Sometimes they end up worse off than they were. So clearly it was already happening. But this case, they were going to their own people. They were generally going to the Gentiles. They would milk them for their money, then they would give them some prophecy. So Paul didn't want to be classed with that. So he's decided that, no, I'm going to make my own way. And I think that's a good thing for those of us too, is to, be willing. Good reason why we too should do that, because we don't want it to look like this is a job for us. It's not a job. it's caring for people's souls shouldn't be looked at as, well, I'm going to move to something better where I can get more power or more opportunity or whatever. I'm a carer of souls, so I need to stay where I am unless God says you need to go and then there's a good parting of ways. That's different, but we should really care for people's souls. So and because of our souls, Paul talks about that we have hope. We have hope because we know that Yeshua is going to come back again. And in fact, at this time, even though Yeshua hadn't left long before, they were expecting that he would actually come back already. They were thinking he would, because the tribulation and the persecution and all of the affliction that was happening to them was so great that they were like, it can't be that long. He has to be coming back anytime now. Of course, we know, like he said before, Yeshua says that there's many more I have to bring in, so it wasn't the right time. But we also need to remember, if you study and reading a little bit of Josephus and others, that when a general would go out, and this is, well, I think, especially that verse that talks about the dead will be taken up. The dead will be taken up, we will meet him in the air. But I believe that if we can look a little more of the context and the history of how they would have viewed it. A general goes out, he wins the war. He comes back with the booty, he comes back with all the captives, he comes back with the leader of the general of the army that he defeated. And these people come out to meet him. And, they would be throwing, like, whatever, they would have flowers, and the general and the other soldiers would be throwing booty. So you could kind of see a little bit of the history of even maybe before this was already happening, but parades. When you go to a parade, there's candy thrown and all sorts of things, right? So, but the general would come back, these people would meet him, then they would go back, together after they had won the victory. So likewise, when we meet him in the air, we're going to come back victorious with him. We're not going to go live somewhere else. We all are saved. We are all part of Israel. We all accept the responsibilities, and we accept also when Israel rejoices, we rejoice. When they're sad, we're sad. Because Elohim, God created Israel to show the light. Now we know that a lot of them aren't at this point showing the light, but still, because he chose them, we need to understand this is who we are as well. So when the general would come back, they would meet, they would go back. And that's, I believe that in the context, that's how Paul would have been viewing it. So even when Yeshua comes back, yes, we will meet him in the air, but we will meet him and we will come back and reign with him, and he will come back and destroy the enemy. So the first time he leaves, it's the first time, he comes. And this is the reason why, because he can't, it doesn't make sense if you are part of me, but you don't want to be part of me. Okay, if you're going to cause me problems, go somewhere else. Because clearly, you don't want to be here anyways, and I don't want to make you if it's not where you need to be. So also what I'm saying here is that because of sin, the relationship had to be restored. So we saw the repentance, we saw forgiveness, because now that Yeshua, what he did for us, we can be saved because we believe in him. So he had to come back, even though many of them, if you read some of the Gospels, it talks about how certain times, at least Matthew talks about, he left the crowd because the crowd was going to force him. They wanted to force him to become their king because they saw the miracles. They said, okay, let's make him our king. Let's go, let's take up the swords. Let's go defeat Rome. It wasn't Yeshua's time to defeat Rome yet. So he has to go back to the Father. Then when it's the right time, the Father will send him. So here we are. We're being told of how it's going to look like when he comes back, when the Father says, get your bride. He's going to come back for those who believe, and who are, if you believe, you do what he says. So he's going to come back, and we're going to rule and reign with him. So that's what's happening here. He's coming back the second time, not as a suffering servant, not as Ben Yosef. He's coming back as Ben David, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he is going to destroy the enemy. And we're going to be there alongside him while that's happening. We're going to help him. So, verse 18, and I'll just end with verse 18, wherefore comfort one another with these words. So, any other? That's it. Normally, if I had a little more time, I would have given a little more time for questions and comments, but hopefully next time we will. So, okay, thank you, Luel.
Far. Let's come and blow Tekiah, Shevarim, and Tekiah. Right? Come on. Those who have the shofar.
Yes, come.
Okay, so Tekiah, Shevarim, Tekiah, one sound, and then three sounds, and then one sound, right? Okay, go. Tekiah.